The dust was a living thing, a fine red grit that coated Eliza's tongue and settled in the folds of her plain wool dress. It rose in choking cloud from the wagon wheels, a constant, gritty reminder of how far she was from anything she had ever known as home. Each jarring rut in the trail felt like a pronouncement of her exile. The sky above was a vast, unforgiving canvas of bleached blue, so immense it seemed to swallow the pathetic rattle of their progress. Her father sat beside her, his jaw set like a block of granite, his knuckles white on the reins. He had not spoken a word to her in 2 days, not since he had hauled her trunk from her room and announced her fate with the same emotional investment he might use to declare a fence post rotten. "A man needs a wife," he had said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the peeling paint of the kitchen wall. Her mother had wept, but they were the thin, useless tears of a woman who had long ago surrendered her will. Her sisters, pretty, slender things with ribbons in their hair, had exchanged a glance. It was a look Eliza knew well, a mixture of pity, relief, and a sliver of cruel amusement. The joke. It had been whispered in parlors, a piece of town gossip that had finally taken root in her own house. The reclusive rancher, Silas Kane, needed a woman for his homestead out in the Badlands. He didn't care what she looked like, the rumor went, so long as she had a strong back and wasn't afraid of silence. And so, the town's most prominent family, embarrassed by their stout, plain-faced eldest daughter, had decided to solve 2 problems at once. They would answer the rancher's need and rid themselves of their shame in a single, brutal transaction. They were sending Eliza. The finality of it was a cold stone in her stomach. She was 22, an age when her sisters were entertaining suitors with blushing smiles and practiced melodies on the pianoforte. Eliza's hands were capable, her mind sharp, but her face lacked the delicate symmetry the world demanded, and her body was built for endurance, not for corsets. She was, in the parlance of her family, a disappointment, an anchor, and now they had cut the rope. The landscape grew harsher, the gentle, rolling hills of her youth giving way to stark, wind-scoured buttes and jagged rock formations that clawed at the sky. The air grew thin and sharp. Finally, her father pulled the horses to a halt. Before them sat a cabin, little more than a dark smudge against the endless expanse of ochre and gray. It was not a home. It was a testament to survival, hunkered low to the ground as if hiding from the wind. A plume of smoke, thin as a thread, rose from a stone chimney. A few tough-looking cattle grazed nearby, their heads bowed against the ceaseless breeze. "This is it," her father said, the first words in 100 miles. He didn't get down. He simply gestured with his chin. "Get your trunk." The command was flat, devoid of emotion. Eliza moved, her limbs stiff and clumsy with dread. She slid over the side of the wagon, her worn boots sinking into the soft dust. The silence was profound, broken only by the sighing of the wind and the creak of the wagon's leather harness. She wrestled her small, battered trunk over the side. It landed with a dull thud, sending up another puff of red dust. It contained everything she owned: 3 dresses, a change of linen, her grandmother's sewing kit, and a single, well-worn book of poetry she had hidden at the bottom. She turned back to the wagon, a desperate, unspoken plea lodging in her throat. For a moment, she saw a flicker of something in her father's eyes. It wasn't kindness. It was the hard, flinty look of a man sealing a bargain he found distasteful but necessary. He saw her not as a daughter, but as a problem solved. "He's a hard man, but fair," her father stated, as if that absolved him. "He needs a worker. You'll work. You'll earn your keep." He gathered the reins, the leather groaning in protest. "Don't expect to come back." The words were not a warning. They were a verdict. He slapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, turning in a wide, clumsy arc. Eliza stood frozen, a solitary figure in a landscape built of loneliness, and watched it go. She watched until the wagon was just a dark speck, and then nothing at all, swallowed by the vast, indifferent terrain. The dust settled around her feet. The wind tugged at the stray hairs that had escaped her tight bun, whipping them against her cheek like tiny lashes. She was alone. The sheer, terrifying weight of that fact pressed down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. This was it, the punchline of the joke. She had been delivered. A long moment passed. The world was nothing but wind and dust and the hammering of her own heart. Then the cabin door opened. A man emerged, stepping out of the shadows into the harsh afternoon light. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his form silhouetted against the dark interior. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, his boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. As he drew closer, she saw that he was younger than the rumors had suggested, perhaps 30 or so, but the land had already carved its story onto his face. His skin was weathered to the color of old leather, and his eyes, a startlingly pale gray, were narrowed against the sun. A dark, untrimmed beard covered the lower half of his face, but it could not hide the grim set of his mouth. He was Silas Kane. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her, then her trunk, then the empty horizon where the wagon had disappeared. It was an unnerving appraisal, methodical and unreadable. Eliza braced herself for the sneer, the look of disgust or disappointment. She had seen it 1,000 times before. She dropped her eyes to the ground, her shoulders hunching inward, a reflexive posture of defense. But the sneer never came. He said nothing. The silence stretched, becoming a thing of substance between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble, rough like stones scraping together. "You're here." It was not a question. Eliza could only manage a nod, her throat too tight for words. He looked at her trunk. "That all you have?" Again, she nodded. He grunted, a sound that was neither kind nor unkind. He walked past her, bent down, and lifted the heavy trunk with one hand as if it were a satchel of feathers. He turned back toward the cabin without another word. The expectation was clear. She was to follow. Taking a shaky breath that tasted of dust and despair, Eliza did. The inside of the cabin was dark and smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, something wild and clean like pine needles after a rain. It was a single room, meticulously ordered. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its embers glowing faintly. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. In one corner was a bed, neatly made with a wool blanket. Along the opposite wall were shelves stacked with tins, sacks of flour and beans, and tools. It was a space stripped of all sentiment, a fortress of pure function. Silas set her trunk down near a narrow cot tucked into the darkest corner of the room, a space clearly meant for her. "This is yours," he said, his back to her. He gestured vaguely toward a bucket of water on a washstand. "Pump is out back. Outhouse is beyond it. The work starts at sunrise." He turned to face her then, and for the first time, their eyes met directly. His gaze was intense, searching. It held no judgment of her appearance, none of the revulsion she had been conditioned to expect. It held something far more disconcerting, a profound, soul-deep weariness, and a raw pragmatism that chilled her to the bone. He was not looking at a woman. He was looking at a pair of hands, a strong back. He was assessing an asset. "I don't care who you are or why they sent you," he said, his voice level. "The land doesn't care. The work doesn't care. Pull your weight, and you'll have a roof and a meal. Fail, and the prairie will take you. It's that simple." He moved to the hearth and began to stir the embers, his attention already elsewhere. The audience was over. Eliza stood by her trunk, the man's stark words echoing in the oppressive quiet. There was no cruelty in his tone, only the brutal honesty of the land itself. It was a truth far colder than her father's contempt. Here, her worth would be measured not by her face, but by her ability to endure. For the first time, she wondered which was worse. She sank onto the edge of the cot, the straw-filled mattress rustling beneath her, and listened to the lonely sound of the wind howling around the corners of her new prison. The tears she had refused to shed in the wagon began to fall, hot and silent, onto her dusty hands. The first week was a blur of aching muscles and silent meals. The work began before the sun had even thought of cresting the horizon, and ended long after it had bled out across the plains. Eliza, who had thought herself strong, discovered new definitions of exhaustion. Her hands, accustomed to needlework and kneading dough, were quickly rubbed raw from mending fences, hauling water, and chopping wood. Silas worked beside her, a silent, relentless machine. He never offered praise, but he never criticized either. He simply set the pace, and she struggled to keep up, driven by the stark terror of his initial warning. Fail, and the prairie will take you. Their interactions were brutally sparse. He would point to a section of fence that needed repair, hand her the tools, and walk away. He would gesture to the dwindling woodpile, and she would pick up the axe. At mealtimes, they sat at the small table in a silence so thick she could feel it pressing against her eardrums. He ate quickly, his focus entirely on the food, then would rise and return to some task outside. Eliza ate slowly, trying to make the meager portions last, her shame a constant, bitter sauce on every bite. She felt less like a person and more like a piece of farm equipment he had acquired, a tool to be used until it broke. Yet, in the midst of this bleak existence, a strange thing began to happen. The physical labor, which she had dreaded, became a kind of solace. When she was straining to lift a heavy log or concentrating on stretching a wire taut, her mind had no room for the echoes of her sister's laughter or her father's dismissive glare. The burn in her muscles crowded out the ache in her heart. The land, in its unforgiving way, was honest. It did not mock her girth or her plain features. It demanded strength, and to her own surprise, she found she had it. The body her family had scorned, the solid, sturdy frame she had tried to hide beneath shapeless dresses, was an asset here. It could endure. She began to watch him, this silent, solitary man. She watched the way he moved, with a quiet confidence that spoke of a deep, instinctual understanding of his world. He could read the sky for signs of rain, predict the movement of the cattle with a glance, and fix a broken pump with a few deft turns of a wrench. He treated his animals with a gruff, unsentimental care that was more profound than any spoken affection. He would spend an hour in the cold, rubbing down a horse after a long ride, his large, calloused hands gentle on the animal's flank. He spoke more to his dog, a scruffy gray creature named Ash, than he did to her. Slowly, tentatively, Eliza began to claim a space for herself within the rigid confines of their life. The cabin, though his, needed a woman's touch. She began by scrubbing the floorboards until the wood gleamed, a small act of defiance against the encroaching dust. She found a patch of dry, protected earth behind the cabin and, using seeds she'd found in a tin, started a small vegetable garden. She mended the curtains, her needle moving with a forgotten grace. She started baking bread, the warm, yeasty smell filling the small space and momentarily chasing away the scent of loneliness. Silas said nothing of these changes, but she noticed that he began to wipe his boots more thoroughly before entering. He started leaving the flour sack on a lower shelf where she could reach it more easily. One evening, after a particularly grueling day repairing the roof of the barn, she found a small, intricately carved wooden bird sitting on her cot. It was whittled from a piece of scrap pine, its form simple but perfect. There was no note. He never mentioned it. But when she looked up, she saw him watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight, before he turned away. The small bird felt heavy in her hand, a silent word in a language she was only just beginning to learn. A month turned into 2, and the raw edges of her despair began to soften. The shame was still there, a low, persistent hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer the only note she could hear. She was finding a new rhythm, one dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by the judgment of others. She was becoming competent. The swing of her axe was sure, her hands had toughened into callous tools, and she could walk for miles under the hot sun without tiring. The first real shift between them came during a late spring storm. A ewe, heavy with lamb, had gone into a difficult labor. The rain fell in cold, driving sheets, and the wind howled like a banshee. Silas had been working for hours, his face grim, his efforts to help the struggling animal proving fruitless. He finally came back into the cabin, soaked to the bone, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "She's not going to make it," he said, his voice raw. "The lamb is turned." Eliza looked at his exhausted face, then toward the barn. An old memory surfaced, a piece of wisdom from her grandmother, a woman who had also been plain and sturdy and had known the ways of the earth. "Let me try," she said, her own voice surprising her with its steadiness. Silas looked at her, skepticism warring with desperation in his eyes. He gave a short, sharp nod. Eliza pulled on his oversized oilskin coat and ventured into the storm. In the dim, lantern-lit barn, the ewe lay panting, her cries weak. Eliza spoke to the animal in a low, soothing voice, her hands, now so strong, surprisingly gentle as she examined the situation. Her grandmother's instructions came back to her with perfect clarity. It took a long, terrifying hour, her arm deep inside the ewe, her muscles screaming in protest. But then she felt the tiny hooves, and with a final, desperate effort, she managed to turn the lamb. It came in a rush of fluid and blood, small and slick and terrifyingly still. She cleared its airway, rubbing it vigorously with a piece of dry sacking until, with a sputter and a gasp, it took its first breath. When she finally stumbled back into the cabin, dawn was breaking. Silas was sitting at the table, a mug of cold coffee untouched before him. He stood up as she entered. He didn't need to ask. He could see the mixture of blood and life on her arms, the profound exhaustion and quiet triumph on her face. He walked over to her, stopping so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He reached out, not to touch her, but to take the heavy, wet coat from her shoulders. His calloused fingers brushed her arm, and a jolt went through her, sharp and unexpected. "Thank you," he said. The two words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of 100 conversations. In his pale gray eyes, she saw something new, something that went beyond the appraisal of a worker. It was respect. And in that moment, standing in the quiet of the cabin as the storm finally broke outside, Eliza felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead. A sense of her own worth, earned not in a parlor, but in a storm-swept barn, with her own two hands. The small wooden bird on her cot suddenly seemed like a promise. The seasons turned, bleeding one into the next, painting the vast landscape in shifting palettes of pale green, dusty gold, and finally, the stark white of winter. The respect Silas had shown her after the lamb's birth was not a fleeting thing. It was a seed that, once planted, began to quietly grow. The silence between them remained, but its character changed. It was no longer the tense, brittle silence of strangers, but the comfortable, companionable quiet of two people who understood each other without the need for constant chatter. Their life was a shared dance of labor, and they had learned each other's rhythms perfectly. Eliza found herself thriving in the harsh environment. The relentless sun and wind had weathered her face, but had also chased away the pallor of indoor life, replacing it with a healthy, ruddy glow. The physical work had sculpted her body, transforming her soft, girlish roundness into the firm, capable strength of a woman. She no longer saw a fat and ugly girl in her reflection in the water bucket. She saw a survivor. She saw a woman whose body was a testament to her own resilience. She had stopped thinking of the ranch as her prison and had begun to see it as her sanctuary. Their communication evolved into a complex language of gestures and shared glances. When he came in from the cold, she would have a hot mug of coffee waiting on the table. When she struggled to lift a heavy sack of feed, he would appear at her side and take the weight without a word. He began to leave wildflowers for her on the windowsill, tough, resilient prairie blooms that mirrored her own transformation. One evening, he found her engrossed in her book of poetry by the firelight. He didn't mock her. Instead, the next time he went to the distant town for supplies, he returned with 2 new books, which he left on her cot without comment. The world outside the ranch ceased to exist for Eliza. Her former life, with its stifling expectations and casual cruelties, felt like a story someone had told her about a different person. Her family's faces grew hazy in her memory, their voices faint and powerless. Her reality was the smell of rain on dry earth, the warmth of the fire, the solid presence of the silent man who shared her days. She began to notice the small things about Silas. The way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when Ash, his dog, did something amusing. The surprising gentleness in his large hands when he was mending a piece of leather. The deep, resonant timbre of his voice on the rare occasions he chose to speak at length. She realized she was no longer afraid of him. She was no longer afraid of anything. The true test came with the first great blizzard of the year. It arrived without warning, a monstrous wall of white that descended upon the plains and erased the world. The wind shrieked, a physical force that battered the small cabin and piled snow in massive drifts against the walls. For 3 days, they were utterly marooned, the cabin a tiny, fragile ark in a churning sea of white. Survival became their only focus. They worked together in a seamless, unspoken partnership. They took turns keeping the fire roaring, its hungry flames the only thing holding the deadly cold at bay. They battled their way to the barn through chest-high snow to feed the terrified, shivering animals. The rope they tied between the cabin and the barn door, their only lifeline in the blinding chaos. The world shrank to the confines of their small shelter, the howling of the wind a constant, terrifying companion. On the second night of the storm, a section of the barn roof, heavy with snow, gave a sickening groan and threatened to collapse. Silas, knowing the animals would be lost, insisted on going out to shore it up. Eliza pleaded with him to wait, her voice tight with a fear that was entirely for him. He just looked at her, his jaw set. "They're our responsibility." She watched from the cabin door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, as he fought his way through the blizzard. He was a dark, solitary figure battling a primal force. An hour passed, then 2. The fear in her chest became a cold, hard knot. Just as she was about to tie the rope around her own waist and go after him, the cabin door burst open, and he stumbled inside, covered in snow, a dark gash on his forehead. A heavy beam had shifted, grazing him as it fell. He slumped into a chair by the fire, waving away her frantic questions. "I'm fine. The roof will hold." But he wasn't fine. The gash was deep, and he was shivering uncontrollably, his usual strength leached away by the cold and the exertion. Eliza's fear was instantly replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. She gently pushed him back into the chair, her touch firm. She fetched the basin of warm water and, with steady hands, began to clean the wound. He sat perfectly still under her ministrations, his head bowed. The firelight flickered across his face, softening its hard lines. His pale gray eyes watched her, and for the first time, she saw not just respect or weariness, but a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own on the day she had arrived. As she carefully stitched the cut with a needle and thread from her grandmother's kit, their proximity was intense. She could feel the heat of his skin, smell the scent of pine and cold air that clung to him. When she was finished, she draped a thick blanket over his shoulders. He didn't pull away. He looked up at her, his gaze holding hers. The wind howled outside, a counterpoint to the sudden, profound silence within the cabin. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You could have left. That first summer. Taken your chances." Eliza paused, her hand still resting on the blanket on his shoulder. She considered the question. She thought of the dust, her father's back, the crushing loneliness. "Where would I have gone?" she answered, her own voice quiet but clear. "This is the first place I've ever been useful," she corrected herself. "The first place I've ever felt valued." A long moment passed. He reached up and covered her hand with his own. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound, elemental connection, a recognition. "You are not just useful, Eliza," he said, speaking her name for the first time. The sound of it in his rough voice was a revelation. "You are everything." The storm raged on outside, but inside the small, fire-lit cabin, the world had shifted on its axis. The space between them, once a chasm of silence and uncertainty, had been bridged. They were no longer just a rancher and his hired help. brought together by a cruel joke. They were a man and a woman who had found each other in the heart of the wilderness, who had weathered the storm together and emerged irrevocably changed. As she looked into his eyes, she saw her own reflection, not as the world saw her, but as he did, strong, resilient, and beautiful. The last vestiges of her old shame finally dissolved, burned away by the warmth of the fire and the startling, life-altering heat of his hand on hers. When the blizzard finally broke, it left behind a world transformed. The landscape was buried under a blanket of pristine white, the air scrubbed clean and sharp, the silence absolute. It felt like a new beginning. The bond forged between Eliza and Silas in the heart of the storm was as solid and real as the frozen ground beneath their feet. The unspoken rules of their arrangement had been rewritten. They were partners now, in every sense of the word. The spring that followed was a time of quiet joy. The harshness of the land remained, but it was now a shared challenge, not a solitary struggle. Laughter, a sound Eliza had thought she'd forgotten, began to find its way into the small cabin. It was a rare, precious thing, usually sparked by the antics of Ash the dog or a shared moment of relief after a hard day's work. The sparse dialogue of their early days gave way to longer conversations by the fire, where they shared stories of their pasts. He told her of his own family, of a father just as demanding but far less cruel than hers, and of the profound betrayal by a woman in his youth that had driven him to this solitary life. He spoke of his initial distrust of her arrival, the anger he'd felt at the callousness of her family's joke. "I saw the fear in your eyes that first day," he admitted one evening, his gaze fixed on the flames. "And I saw their cruelty in the dust from their wagon. I decided then that I would not be a part of it. I would give you the chance the world had not." Eliza, in turn, spoke of her childhood, of the constant, subtle wounds of being unfavored, of the suffocating feeling of being judged and found wanting at every turn. To speak of it aloud to him did not bring back the pain. Instead, it robbed the memories of their power. They became just a story, the preface to the real chapter of her life, which was being written here, now with him. Their physical intimacy grew as naturally as the wild grass on the plains. It began with lingering touches, a hand on the small of her back as they passed in the narrow space of the cabin, his fingers brushing hers as he handed her a tool. It culminated one warm evening under a sky littered with stars, a silent, tender coming together that was less about passion and more about a deep, soulful affirmation of everything they had become to one another. It was a quiet, sacred act that sealed their partnership, transforming the small cabin from a shelter into a home, and the narrow cot in the corner into their shared bed. By the time the summer sun beat down on the plains again, turning the land to bronze, Eliza knew she was pregnant. There was no grand announcement. One morning, as a wave of nausea passed over her, she simply met his eyes across the table, and he knew. A slow, rare smile spread across his face, reaching his pale gray eyes and transforming them. He came to her side, knelt before her, and placed a reverent hand on her still flat stomach. The child was not an accident or a consequence. It was a culmination. It was a symbol of the life they had built from the dust, a testament to the love that had grown in the unlikeliest of places. Nearly 2 years had passed since her arrival. The ranch was no longer just surviving. It was thriving in its own modest way. The herd was larger, the garden was a riot of color and produce, and a new room had been added to the cabin in anticipation of the baby. Eliza herself was unrecognizable from the shamed, frightened girl who had been abandoned in the dust. Her body was full and strong with pregnancy, her movements confident and sure. Her face, framed by hair that she now often wore loose, was open and serene. The brand of her family's judgment had been erased, replaced by the quiet dignity of a woman who knew her own worth. One day, Silas looked at their dwindling supply of salt and flour. "We need to go to town," he said. The nearest town of any size was still a day's ride, the very same town that bordered her family's lands. A cold flicker of the old fear touched Eliza's heart, but it was fleeting. She looked at Silas, at his steady, protective presence, felt the kick of the life inside her, and nodded. Yes, we do. The journey back along that familiar trail was a strange reversal of her first trip. This time, she was not an exile being cast out, but a woman returning on her own terms. She sat beside Silas in the sturdy wagon he had built himself, her hand resting on his arm. The landscape, once a symbol of her desolation, now felt like a part of her, its stark beauty a reflection of the life she had forged. When they arrived in town, the noise and bustle were a shock to her system after 2 years of prairie silence. People stared. She knew they were looking at her, at the rough-hewn man beside her, at her swollen belly visible beneath her simple dress. But for the first time in her life, she did not flinch from their gazes. She held her head high, her hand linked with Silas's. They were leaving the general store, their arms laden with supplies, when it happened. A carriage, far too ornate for the dusty street, pulled to a halt nearby. Her sister, Amelia, stepped out, dressed in silk and lace, her arm linked with that of a well-dressed, soft-looking man. A moment later, her father emerged from the driver's seat, his face thicker and more florid than she remembered. They saw her. Amelia's mouth fell open, her perfectly painted lips forming a small O of shock. Her father froze, his hand on the carriage door, his eyes wide with disbelief. They stared, not at the stout, plain girl they had sent away, but at the composed, radiant woman who stood before them. They saw her rounded stomach, the protective stance of the bearded man at her side, the way his calloused hand held hers with such gentle possession. Eliza, Amelia whispered, the name a puff of disbelief. Eliza felt Silas's hand tighten on hers, a silent offer of strength. But she didn't need it. She looked at her sister, at the life of silks and parlor games she represented, and felt nothing. No envy, no anger, not even pity. She looked at her father, at the man who had discarded her like a broken tool, and the old, deep wound within her was simply gone. He held no more power over her. She gave him a small, calm smile. It was not a smile of triumph or revenge, but one of genuine, untroubled peace. "Amelia, father," she said, her voice even and clear. "It is a fine day." The simplicity of the greeting, the utter lack of accusation or recrimination, seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst would have. Her father's face went from shock to a deep, mottled red of embarrassment. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, no words coming out. What could he say? The walking, breathing embodiment of his cruel joke stood before him, not broken, but whole, not ruined, but thriving. She was the one who had found a life, a home, a love that was as real and enduring as the land itself. The joke, it was now devastatingly clear, was on him. His petty, cruel solution had resulted in her salvation. Without another word, Eliza turned away, Silas at her side. They packed their supplies into the wagon, the eyes of her family burning into their backs. As Silas helped her up onto the seat, he paused and looked back at her father, his pale gray eyes as hard and cold as a winter sky. He said nothing, but his gaze was a judgment more potent than any curse. They rode out of town, leaving the noise and the ghost behind them. The wagon wheels kicked up the familiar red dust, but now it was the dust of their road home. As the town receded, Eliza leaned her head against Silas's shoulder, her hand resting on her belly, where their child stirred in agreement. She looked ahead, at the vast, open horizon that had once terrified her. It no longer seemed empty. It was full of promise. It was freedom. The cruelest thing her family had ever done had been to send her away. It was also the greatest gift they could have ever given her. She had been sent into the wilderness to be lost, but instead, in the heart of the silence, in the arms of a quiet man, she had finally, truly been found.